Well, hello everybody. Good morning if you're in the US, or good afternoon if you're in London, UK, or Europe, or good evening if you're anywhere else. And it's great to have you here at this British American Business webinar with our guest, Kevin Sneeder. I'll introduce Kevin in a moment, but a couple of housekeeping rules first. Probably everyone's a bit of an expert now on Zoom, but just to remind you, all the participants are in mute mode. You're listen only. I'm going to talk to Kevin for 45 minutes or so, and we'll leave some time for Q&A at the end. But please send in your questions throughout the program, where I will do my best to weave them into the conversation as we go along, and use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen rather than the chat feature. That we've disabled the chat feature. So it's great to have you all along. Kevin Sneeder is the global managing partner at McKinsey & Company, a firm he's been with for some 30 years. And during that time, he's worked in the UK, in the US, in Europe, and most recently in Asia, where he's normally based. Delighted to say that Kevin's a great friend to British American business. In fact, as the whole firm at McKinsey & Company has been for many years. And it's great to have you with us, Kevin. I think some people, hopefully people know that McKinsey & Company has been publishing kind of frequently throughout this crisis. And that's what stimulated me to get in touch with Kevin to do this. And maybe we'll start there if we may. And at the end of March, you published a paper called Beyond Coronavirus, The Path to the Next Normal. And in it, you talked about 5 stages from the start of the pandemic to the next normal: resolve, resilience, return, reimagination, and reform. So maybe just to kick things off, maybe you could just expand a little bit on that and tell us where you think the world is on this journey.
Well, the headline would be "The world's in different places." And first and foremost, thank you for asking me to join this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you're watching this. And let me also just say that I hope everyone is staying well. And for those who are not, my deepest sympathies. I know this is a very challenging time for everyone. And so I should begin by putting any comments I make in that context, because it's very easy to drift into perhaps sounding as if you're talking about opportunities, but no one, I think, mistakes the scale of the challenge that the world faces. And the human side to that challenge is very real. So I'll just say that first and foremost. When we wrote the article, which was about 3-4 weeks ago, it was with an eye to really trying to think about where is the world going to be and what's the path to get there. And the headline, the notion of a next normal, really was, Duncan, was as much to do with the reality that we felt was there was not going back to what we had before, that we were going to something different. And the question is, well, what will that be, and how do we map a journey towards that so-called next normal? And as we thought about it, we really felt there are essentially 5 parts to that discussion, which is what the article touches on. The first was the immediate phase, which is resolving the approach for the here and now, which really came down to colleagues, customers, and cash in many cases. Colleagues, because the first issue is, of course, the health and safety of everyone who works in an enterprise, a business, or an institution. And that was really the notion of resolve. Resolve your approach to ensuring that's the case. Resolve how you're going to deal with customers, and resolve how you're going to handle cash to make sure you can keep the business afloat. And that was the immediate focus, I think, for many in the first few weeks. And I say the first few weeks because, of course, everyone's got a different starting point. If you were in Asia, that starting point was quite some time ago. If you were in the United States, it was about 4 or 5 weeks ago, probably 6 now. And if you were in Europe, maybe an extra week on top of that. So the realities were different, but this first phase was around resolve. The second phase, which was really around resilience, was to say, this isn't going to be over quickly. So how do you build some resilience to ensure that the business can indeed withstand the repeated shocks it's going to face? And I think that phase is one that many have just left behind or are still in. which is the notion of putting in place an organization structure, a financing model, and a set of relationships with customers and employees alike that has enough to it that it can serve and withstand all that's going on in the current moment. And much of the world was right there. What has happened, I think, over the last 2 or 3 weeks, and again, differs by geography, but it has been our focus on the third step, which is return. How do we bring businesses back up? Remember, more people get killed coming down the mountain than going up. So it's in reality, how do you think about making sure that the business is going to be safe and able to withstand the reality of having to return? It's going to be very difficult to do that. And nobody can think that's an easy task. It's much harder to turn machinery on than off. And so with that notion in place, it's really been a journey which I think many businesses are now starting to ensure they have the processes in place, they've got a clarity, and they can think about return. Governments are, of course, also wrestling with that, whether it's in the United States or in the UK or elsewhere. You can see lots of debate happening around when will it be okay to return? What are the indicators? How do we think about that? I'm sure we'll get into that conversation, but that was the third step. The fourth step, which was reimagination, really touched on what I said at the beginning, that we're not going back to what we had. So how do you bring a business back in a way that ensures it's built for the future and not just built for the past? And that has got many aspects to it that we certainly find differ around the world. And the last piece in reform is, as we think about what this next normal will look like, I think one of the things that's going to be very different is the attitudes of society towards business, the attitudes of society towards government. In many respects, that's going to be a key feature of the next normal and is therefore going to be reform. That reform could be legislative, excuse me, it could be regulatory, it could take many aspects. I don't get nervous when I sneeze now. People usually send me notes saying, are you okay? I think I am okay. But just on this point of reform, there becomes this real need to think about how the external world is going to take place and take shape and how that's going to differ the way people conduct themselves. So we were trying to lay out 5 steps. One point, it's not linear. I think we're going to find ourselves going between some of these steps, going back to go forward. And therefore, I think it's important to understand that this was a way of characterizing the different elements rather than saying they'll happen sequentially.
And certainly there are companies and industries which are at different stages on that journey, as well as countries that are on different stages of that journey. Sadly, there are still plenty of companies from giants to SMEs, which are still trying to battle about resilience and
very much so.
And just about the real issues of can they make payroll this weekend. So I mean,
absolutely. And I think on that, Duncan, it's important not to over dramatize the need to immediately focus on return, because that is not what we're saying. I agree with you. I think for many, the focus remains firmly on this resilience phase. But I think in there lies the challenge. And one of the realities of this is, I think, depending on the size of the business or its industry, it's almost as if you've got a group of people who need to remain firmly focused on that reality of resilience, ensuring they can meet payroll, ensuring they can care for their customers and their colleagues. All of that requires so much effort that I think is very much going to preoccupy a significant body of leadership. And it therefore is the case that I think you need almost a separate group who are thinking about the plan ahead, the way forward. Because I think to try and do both with the same group of people is really difficult for the reason you outlined. And one of the things we're encouraging people to do is to really separate the two tasks. Make sure you have a group that's firmly focused on resilience and a separate group that's really able to think about the plan for the future, the plan ahead, the return, and so on.
So around the same time as the paper you authored came out, another paper came out from McKinsey called Safeguarding Our Lives and Our Livelihoods, the Imperative of Our Time. And I was completely intrigued by this paper because it seemed to make the case at a time when not many other people were making it, of the trade-off between the kind of health issue, the government response, the kind of the lockdown, as it were, and the implications for the economy. And yeah, since then, of course, this debate has raged, including with kind of social unrest or social demonstrations across the United States this weekend. So how do you think that governments are managing this very tricky trade-off? I mean, where do you see this at the moment? Where does your firm see this trade-off at the moment?
Well, we released both reports on the same day, and that was deliberate for the reason that you mentioned, which is we believe, first and foremost, saving lives, of course, takes priority. And let me be sure there's no doubt about that. Our report makes that crystal clear. But we also believe it's saving lives and safeguarding livelihoods that both need to be considered. But there is no trade-off in some sense around saving lives. But of course, there is a reality that in the event that livelihoods are diminished to a point at which you've got massive unemployment, real hardship, that has a health consequence too. A very real health consequence, can be mental health and physical health. And the point we were trying to make was the real challenge for everyone tackling this crisis is to time bound the period, the duration for which the absolute urgency around the lockdown and related matters takes priority, so that there can be a place in which the global economy can restart, and as it restarts, it can ensure the livelihoods of the population. And so we were trying to argue that both need to be considered, but let's be clear, we're not saying that saving lives somehow or other is not the first task. That is the first task. In terms of where we are today, that debate is now becoming a vigorous one, because we're really now in this heat of the issue, which is how long? For how long is economic activity going to be suppressed? And at what point can we indeed start to bring back the economy? How do you know when that is? And our paper really tried to set out, we recognize there are at least two sides to the initial question and then how you think about it. The initial question, I think, is based on, if you think about the virus itself, how fast and how effectively can we indeed control the virus? Because that's the driving element that talks to the first part, saving lives. And now we have a lot more insight into that. And the second part is, what are the effects of the significant economic action that's been taken? Because can that economic action really do enough to buy enough time in order to ensure that the actions being taken to suppress the virus are sufficient to then bring the economy back in due course? And that's really what's been going on. And if you think about it, this is where I would say the following. I would say that a lot of action has happened very quickly. We can debate which countries got it right, which got it wrong. But the reality we confront today is in many parts of the world, the virus is either plateauing or at least somewhat the rate of increase is slowing. And if you think about the effectiveness of the economic action, it's been more effective than not. It's been huge in terms of its size. Let's remember, we're talking 8 to 12 times the Marshall Plan. So a massive set of action by government. And so far, it has at least bought some time. It's bought quite a bit of time. The question is, how long can we continue to buy time without jeopardizing the long-term health of the economy, and then as a result, the long-term health of people? And that's what we're dialoguing around now. My own sense is this: I think we are nearing that point where economies are going to come back. In fact, as you know, across Europe, different steps are being taken. So the Scandinavian economies, in particular in Denmark, Sweden, of course, never went to lockdown. Denmark is slowly coming back. Norway, I think primary school kids go back today. In Germany, there's now, I think, 80 small shops, less than 80 square meters, reopened today, and schools go back next week. So we start to see a path that those countries are taking. Clearly, the debate is vigorous in the United States, and people are on all sides of the discussion. But in truth, there is at least now conversation happening, and I think whether it be May 11th, May 15th, or sometime before, I'm not a politician, they will judge, but we're in that zone. So when you put it all together, I think we are now at the intersection of this moment where we think there is enough control, or suppression, let's be clear, because we're far from cure and so on, but suppression of the virus, and the action taken has bought a sufficient amount of time that we can now bring the economy back up. And now I think what we're going to really be debating is, what are the long-term consequences for what that next normal will look like? And what does that mean for the economies of the world and the health of people as we think about vaccines and other aspects coming into play, which really are the solution to the long-term question. And we're still not there in those.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, broadly across the West, governments followed pretty much, variations on a theme of the same strategy. I mean, there are some outliers like we've been reading in Sweden, but in fact, the execution, the willingness to put the full weight of government resources behind a solution has been incredible. I mean, the scale of the financial help provided is just, as you said, 8 to 10 times the size of the Marshall Plan or whatever it may be. I guess people are, people tend to criticize execution more than anything else, don't they? In this context, you know, the details of how this money actually gets into the hands of businesses and so on, rather than there seems to be less debate about the strategy itself, about putting the full weight of the public purse behind finding a solution.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, if you think about the scale of action, it is truly unprecedented. In effect, triggering a recession bigger than anything we've seen since the Depression. You know, so it's orders of magnitude the size of any action that governments have taken since the Second World War, and frankly before the Second World War. So in many respects, you could say that the pace and depth of action is truly unprecedented. And of course, within that context, there are things that people will understandably want to critique and decide could have been handled differently. But that sheer pace and scale of action is unprecedented. There is no corollary for it.
So one of the ideas in that second paper was, again, talking about what the next normal might look like, is this notion of acceptable enforcement mechanisms, which for those of us who've lived our lives in the West is a kind of unusual concept. So the idea that in order to measure the potential for infection of disease, of these pandemics, that there may be a requirement for more surveillance of individuals, and that's sort of the gap, the sort of balance between the kind of personal liberties that we're used to having in the West and what's become more normal in Asia is a very tricky one. I mean, I know you live in Greater China, so you've got a good perspective on this concept.
Well, I think let's disaggregate what's actually in there, because there may be parts of it that are more acceptable and parts of which certainly will not be acceptable to anyone. But if you said that actually what we're talking about is what's the most effective way to ensure contact tracing and tracking, and you start there, then I think you have a different perspective on what may be okay. And will individuals opt in to models that allow for them to be able to show where they've been, who they've interacted with, and in return be, for example, given access in ways that those who don't choose to opt into that can get? That's very different than demanding that everyone has an app that displays whether they're green, yellow, or red according to who they've been with and where they've been. So I think there may be different paths that are more acceptable to, let's call them democracies, than otherwise. The reality we're all going to be grappling with is, are there parts of the health solution, and it is the health solution, the saving lives bit, that do necessitate compromises when it comes to individual liberty? And how far is any given society prepared to accept that? I hope and believe that we'll be able to find that there are ways through this that rely more on the willingness of individuals to provide information in return for recognition that they've done so, and therefore they're able to do things that are consequent on that. But I also recognize that it may well be the case that people and governments decide that they're going to make that choice on behalf of the broader good. And therein lies a real and tangible political debate. I'm not going to wade into it other than to say I think it's real. I do think there has been clearly value associated with being able to accurately say where people have been, accurately understand who they've been exposed to, and accurately trace the consequences of that. How we trade that off going forward, I think time will tell. I think it's careful, though, to set this up as a battle between one school of thought and another school of thought, because there are many dimensions to this. You could also say that the ability to have rapid dissemination of information around breakouts has been a very helpful part of providing a solution in the West, because information immediately gets released. You can see what's going on, and healthcare and government and others can rally to address a problem, as opposed to if you don't share information and you wait for some central authority to release it, well, you can be days or weeks late, and by then untold damage can occur. So let's not get too carried away with labeling one side got it right, one side got it wrong. I think in all of this, we just need to step back and understand the moments and the trade-offs associated with going down different paths. And one of those is indeed attitudes towards, as I say, sharing information which may help the greater good, but we compromise individuals. How are we going to weigh that up as societies? And I think in democracy, that's what governments have to do. I don't know if my end or Duncan's end has frozen, but I can see a frozen screen.
Frozen on my screen. Are you still? That's good.
There you are.
So,
I got you.
just going back to your original paper, the fourth stage of the journey you described is reimagination, which will require companies to kind of reinvent themselves as consumer and cultural preferences and needs, frankly, will change. One phrase that jumped out at me was that the pursuit of efficiency could give way to the requirement of resilience. The end of supply chain globalization, for example, if production and sourcing more closer to the end user. And in your most recent paper published last week, you talk about that again, saying that, you know, in the new normal, distance as a physical concept is likely to come back in a big way. Can you kind of expand on that a little bit? 'Cause we've got lots of people with complex supply chains on this call. I know that.
Well, you know, I think the point we were trying to make is the following, that there are a set of attributes that are going to, I think, change in the next normal. We actually have 7 of them, but I'll focus in on the couple you've picked up on, and the 2 that somewhat interrelate with each other: distance is back and resilience and efficiency. The notion of distance is back is a reference to the reality that we went through a period, let's say from the mid-90s onwards, where books and articles were written about the death of distance. In other words, the notion that the technology forces, digital communications and so on, meant it no longer mattered if I was near you. And on the back of that, of course, it also triggered an ability to do business from far apart in the world. And in a very real way, it allowed supply chains to be built that spanned enormous amounts of geography to ship goods to ultimately an end user who could be quite some distance away from where they were made. And distance therefore got shrunk. Now, here we are today. Distance is back in the sense that border controls have been brought back in many parts of the world. Literally, borders are closed. I think also we've seen a shift in how people feel about distance, feel about things that are further away from them, that they can't quite trace the provenance of, they don't know where they come from. So distance also in the sense of being able to see differently the cost of having things that come from places which are cheaper is now going to be viewed differently. And then the very real consequence of what we've seen, which is the shock to the system, has led to the system shaking in some places and breaking in others. In other words, supply chains have not been able to manage their way through this. If you take the here and now of China, Chinese manufacturing is largely back, but it's not back at full productivity. And in part, that's because components come from around the world. Right. And if one component is missing, and it happens to be a vital component, then you cannot make an item. I was speaking with some ventilator producers, and one of the issues they've got is components come from continental Europe, Switzerland and Italy in this case, neither of which are supplying those components, therefore they cannot produce. Of course, they'll retool and figure out how to do it locally. But that just talks to this issue. Just-in-time inventories, which became a feature of the modern supply chain, have proven also to be stretched to the point at which they are, I wouldn't say breaking, but they're running very low, if not they're out of stock. And so just-in-time inventories have also proven to be problematic. So the combination of this distance is back, plus I think a renewed view of what resilience, or how resilience ranks versus cost and efficiency, is what is coming together in some degree to therefore put in place a different way of looking at supply. And I believe will put pressure on supply chains and will exaggerate that something that's already been happening, reshoring or onshoring, to bring supply closer to the end user. So I do think that's a very real aspect. It's 2 of the 7 that we talk about in terms of the shape of the next normal.
It's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because there's probably also a couple of other issues that are likely to push that trend. One is political, frankly, you know, where you're hearing quite loud voices about repatriating production, particularly in certain kind of sectors of the healthcare industry and so on. And also, I suppose, climate, you know, that it was always a difficult kind of, it's difficult to justify some of these highly complicated supply chains with components moving in and out of jurisdictions multiple times with a commitment to kind of energy efficiency and climate. So there may be more issues driving that trend. And I was intrigued in your view as a firm that has looked at kind of the ESG agenda so much over the years, whether what else you might see in terms of change in the new normal. ESG agenda seem to be consuming more and more time of CEOs and boards over the last year or so. So how does that change? I mean, are some of those aspects of ESG going to move down the agenda? I mean, when sustainability is a question of can you survive? Are you going to get through the next 3 weeks? It makes some of the other questions look a little bit less important.
Well, it might do, and it clearly has done in the very near term in terms of the attitudes towards the immediate focus of customers, colleagues, and cash. So I do think that clearly that's true. But I think if we step back, the amount of energy and focus, energy is the wrong word, but the amount of focus on climate change, if we just take that one, only a few months ago, said that this issue was really now high on the agendas. I suspect it is going to come back, but it's going to have to come back in different ways because there are a few things that have changed. Of course, the price of oil this morning is one factor that's changed. The economics of countries has also changed. At the end of the day, somebody's going to have to pay for this massive injection into the global economy in order to buy time to deal with the virus. And that is not cost-free. And in reality, the ability to, quote, afford some of the climate and related issues and initiatives may actually be compromised because some of the governments, some of the people who want to take the right action are now going to face the real consequence of can they afford to? Can they afford to go to more expensive forms of fuel when cheaper ones are available in the here and now? I really hope they can. And I think we're going to have to, as a world, figure out what we really think is the priority here. Because I think there is going to be a real tension. Just some obvious points. Climate change and the reality that we find ourselves now confronting actually have some of the same attributes. If you just think about some of those attributes, in that they're both got effects that propagate quickly across an increasingly interconnected world. And they have many other, they're both systemic. Climate change affects everyone, not just some. And they have consequences that go far beyond the initial actors. So I may buy cheap fuel, but that is a consequence for the population as a whole, and actually the world as a whole. They're not stationary, they're dynamic, they keep moving. Climate change is building, it keeps getting to a point at which has more and more effects. It's non-linear. The bigger effects of climate change focus harshly on those who are least able to afford it. That's also true, never forget, that's also true of this virus. It is hurting those least able to afford it far more than others. And it's a tragedy of the commons problem. It requires common action if it's going to be tackled. The problem is that then they diverge. Then there are some real differences between climate change and the current crisis, because a global public health crisis like the one we're facing is immediate, it's discrete, and you can sort of see what you have to do in very specific ways. Whereas climate change is different. It's gradual, it's been building, it's cumulative as opposed to one-off there and then. And also it's distributed. It sort of falls across many different places as opposed to hitting everybody at once. And it's that which means that people see this trade-off between climate change and the crisis because they see that they have different characteristics. But deep down, they share more in common than they don't. And that's why I think that over time, the world is still going to have to confront the climate issue. And it can take a back seat, but it can't take it for very long because it's cumulative, it's building up on us, it is going to have an effect, and we are going to have to find a way through. But I recognize that in the near term, there's going to be a vigorous debate around the trade-off and the cost, perhaps, of some of these activities. But I think if we stop pursuing them, we're going to pay a big price very, very soon. Last point, let's not forget that if we reduce the amount of travel and some of the other things that have indeed been suppressed as part of the actions that have been taken, that helps the climate issue. So there are some consequences that if we choose to sustain over time, may actually have a positive contribution, but we are going to have to make some choices. And I think a conscious choice to maintain action on climate as well as tackling this virus.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that struck me about the kind of the broad ESG agenda is the potential for reputational damage for companies, because there are some winners in what's a generally losing kind of hand, but there are some winners. and the responsibility that companies, I think, all now acknowledge that they have to their workforce, their stakeholders, whatever you want to call them, the wider community, is acknowledged by businesses, but how that sort of enacts itself in practice right now and then subsequently is going to be a real test for leadership. It seems to me, making stakeholder capitalism real at a time, it's kind of easier to do it when everyone's winning, but at a time when there are winners and losers, I think it's going to be much more difficult. And being able to answer the question, how did you and your company respond during the crisis? And maybe that leads on to a question about leadership. So I know it's a thing that McKinsey & Co do a huge amount of work on. I mean, what's your sense of how kind of business leaders, I know this is a very general question, but how has business as a group kind of responded? And I don't know whether you have any examples that you share.
Well, you know, there are several parts to answering that question, including the important context.
I know it was a bit of a ramble.
So, yeah, no, but I think both parts are important. Let me deal with the first and then how businesses responded. One of the things that I think is the case is that there will be a day of reckoning around what happened and why. If you think about the great financial crisis of 2008, 2009, it was all too easy to blame the banks. They were the culprits. And it was a financial crisis, so that was not hard to see why people did that. And the banks took the hits. It was their reputation that got really scrutinized. And they suffered for many years around that. And it was therefore the case that the inquiries, and there were many, and the reviews pointed to the banks and focused in on the financial sector for a financial crisis. The challenge with coronavirus, COVID-19, is people are in search of blaming somebody. And we're going to see, and we're already seeing that take the form of blaming foreigners. You know, if you're in the US, you have a view of who could have done this. In Europe or in China, you each have a different view. And trust me, each one has a different view, but they're all blaming somebody. But the problem will come when eventually there will come a domestic reckoning and people will focus in on who did what to whom and when domestically. And I do believe that that will be the moment in time when all of us as leaders will get asked, what did you do during this war? And we have to have a good answer for it. And we have to be responsible in our answers, because nobody has a good war. Nobody wins from this. I don't agree with the term winners and losers, because I think everybody is facing real challenge, but there are definitely some sectors that, because of the very nature of what they do, take the technology sector, which has had to ramp up really quickly to provide the technology that we're using, and yet the provider of that technology is already under enormous scrutiny because of some of the things that happened in the period of ramping up. And how secure was it? Where was the data processed? And lots of questions being asked. That's going to happen on a scale that will dwarf what happened during the global financial crisis, because the economic, health, and other consequences of this are so much greater than what we saw in 2008, 2009. So that scrutiny is going to be vast. And when that scrutiny comes, there will be things that are found that, even if at the time we think we're reasonable, people will just, with the benefit of hindsight, as a wonderful benefit, critique. Some will be fair, much of it will not be fair, but it will nevertheless be a critique. And therefore, I think part of the challenge is how to second guess and foresee that challenge, even if I still think it's going to be unreasonable in some cases. But that is what I think all leaders are busy trying to do, which then tends into your second part of your question: how are business leaders acting? At one level, I think the way they've acted has been very, very impressive. So many businesses have found ways to really do the three things I talked about. First of all, look after their people. I believe the vast majority of businesses have sought to do that. Of course, there are stories about those who did not, but I have encountered many leaders who've had sleepless nights, actually with no sleep for weeks on end, because they've been working really hard to get people home and safe and looked after. And if they do have COVID, to provide care, and who begin any conversation, just as I do, with, tell me about the health of our people. What have we learned? Where are there issues? Any outbreaks we need to know about? That is happening, I believe, far more than any of the horror stories that I've also heard, and must be happening too, because they're being reported. The second thing is, I think people have really tried to look after their customers. And there has genuinely been an attempt to do so, but recognizing everyone is stretched, some to breaking point. But this notion of really looking after customers and trying to help there, I've seen amazing acts right across the business sectors of people working together, competitors working together to alleviate the suffering of customers, or customers receiving payments to bide them over if companies have the cash to do that. And the third thing is finding ways to preserve cash so that they can indeed make payroll, keep people going, and so on. So let's be clear, I think the good stories outweigh the bad stories, but the bad stories are there and are unfortunate. The real question is, when all is said and done, how is this going to play through? And how is business and leadership going to be able to show that they made judgment calls that ultimately did preserve the business as an ongoing concern? Because that's the other reality. I think for all that we can want business to do everything for free, that doesn't help either, because then businesses won't be able to survive, won't be in place in the future, and it will just transfer the burden even more to the taxpayers. So businesses do need to find a way to survive. They have to be responsible, or in dividends, paybacks, and some of the other issues that are definitely being discussed. But they do need to survive, and the model needs to survive in some form, but just adjusted and changed to reflect the new realities we deal in. So at this stage, I would say far more business leaders have risen to this challenge, and they've been able to bring their businesses to remote working in a way that I don't think anyone could have foreseen. Even a couple of years ago, it is astonishing to think that businesses are still able to operate, even though workers cannot talk to each other directly, cannot be with each other. That has been a modern miracle, quite honestly, and we shouldn't underplay it. But there will be review, there will be scrutiny, and there are going to be a lot of questions asked.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think that on the core issues of the care for colleagues and customers, business so far has done well. Of course, there are some outliers, but going forward, do you think that the goodwill of companies will be relied on in terms of behaviour? So companies that have been in receipt of public money, that their behaviour will be in their hands, or do you think there'll be legislation or regulation to control how companies that have been in receipt of public money are allowed to behave? And this question about executive compensation, buybacks, dividends, and so on. What do you think that's going to be, or will it vary country by country?
Well, I think one thing is going to be true, which is there'll be a greater role for government coming out of this crisis than there was going in, for several reasons. One, the very real economic investment that government has made in buying time to find a way to suppress and deal with the virus has come at huge cost. But it's also come in terms of government becoming the lender, the payer, and the insurer of last resort for vast numbers of corporations right across the planet. And if you think about what that has meant in practical terms, in the UK, paying 80% of the wages of those impacted, or in the US, the small business loans and the checks that have been issued and so on, that has to come with some degree of accountability. It just has to. And so I believe that government's intervention and influence in the economy will have to go up, and accountability for the distribution of public funding has to go up. So I think it's hard to imagine a scenario where there is not more oversight, intervention, regulation, and ultimately legislation than there was before. So I think my answer to your question is, no, I don't think people are just going to say goodwill is sufficient. There will be investigations, there will be insight, there will be review. And again, some of that will be conducted in a very animated political context and environment. So it's not always the case that it will be fair in the sense of how that set of decisions made in the heat of the moment get interpreted, but it will happen.
Yeah, fair is a difficult concept, as we all know. So I think in the EU they've already announced that any EU domiciled company that's in receipt of public money there's a moratorium on share buybacks and dividends, I believe.
And there are restrictions in the CARES Act in the US, and there are oversight committees in Congress. It's only just beginning. There will be plenty of opportunity and time and demand for really exercising some oversight over all that's been invested in, as I say, finding time to deal with the virus.
I mean, in your paper, when you talked about the reform stage, there were some areas of government activity that you suggested might be the subject to some major changes because, I guess, of public pressure. And living in the States as I do, it feels like this might be yet another thing that pushes the case for socialized healthcare, socialized medicine. I would like to think that would happen, but who knows? There may be some other things that will happen as well, which we might have considered to be illiberal, like restrictions on travel and all those kind of things. But from the kind of, I mean, there's been this effectively in the West, there's been a massive step towards, whatever you want to call it, government engagement, government funding, socialism, whatever you want to call it. And some of that won't be stepped back, it seems to me. Some of that will stay. I don't know whether you've got any comments on that from the US perspective.
Well, I think it's dangerous to assume that it will only swing one way. I do, having grown up in the UK and having had a brother who had leukemia as a young boy, the NHS is something I care deeply about. So I have a strong view about that institution and the incredible role it's played in the UK. But I don't pretend to want to wade into the healthcare dialogue in the US, but I do think it's going to be more complicated, because I think in truth there are several parts that are coming together in this dialogue. Let's not forget that at the moment the world's hopes hinge on vaccines and the development of a vaccine. And one of the things that I think you've seen happen is the way in which healthcare, and in particular the pharmaceutical and other companies, have rallied to develop and to accelerate their programs in this area, means that the private sector is the one that's really driving that development. At the same time, the way the regulators have chosen to help fast track and bring those products to market shows the role that the public sector has to play in enabling that development to bear fruit. But it is the combination of the private sector and the public sector that's going to do just that. And I suspect that's the dialogue we're going to have. We're going to have an opportunity to really debate what have we learned about the role of the state and the degree of support and the interventions it makes. I also would suggest that just as government has now got more involved, I think one of the debates that will happen is how do we de-government? How do we take government out of business going forward? So I don't think it's just going to be a permanent swing in one direction. I think it's going to be a dialogue. That's probably a polite way of putting it. A real conversation, an urgent discussion, a violent discussion. I don't mean in terms of physically, but in terms of the energy behind the arguments, will flow around the role of the state in healthcare and in other sectors in light of what we've just experienced. But it's a little too early to say how that one's going to play out, because I think there's going to be many different voices that will point to where actually the most impact was had.
Just a reminder to everyone, please send in your questions. We've got a few coming in, so please add them, and I will do my best to get to them over the next 15 minutes. So one of the things that the consequence will be, it feels like there'll be some people looking at bargains, M&A opportunities, both either in equity investments or debt investments. And, again, going back to this question of reputational risk, there's clearly going to be some investment companies that might see that the value of opportunities outweighs the reputational questions about whether they're taking too much of an opportunity, too much of an advantage of a situation. So, I mean, how do you see the balance for kind of hedge funds and private equity companies? What kind of level of engagement in these opportunities do you think there will be? And do you think government will get involved on limiting kind of cross-border M&A?
Well, they may do, and there may be many reasons, geopolitics being part of it. Part of it will be national interest, given what we've learned about healthcare provision and so on. But I think underpinning that question is the reality that there is going to be changes to industry structure, because consumer behavior is clearly changing as a result of this crisis. And the question is what will be sustained and what will not. But we've seen a massive shock to some sectors: travel, hospitality, non-grocery retail, just sectors that are clearly being decisively hit to the point at which, in some cases, revenues have gone to nothing. And it's very hard to sustain a business when your revenues are at zero. Of course, they're being given funds to bridge the gap, but will they come back? Will they be able to go back to what they were, or will there be something quite different? And if there's something quite different, so we're going to see industry structures break down and consolidation occur? I think the answer to that is yes, we will. And in many cases, I think that's going to be an outcome of what's gone on. There will be a consolidation and a change in leadership and structures in different sectors. The role that private equity may play in that, I think they will be a vital part, but there will be other parts too. I think corporations will consolidate because they recognize that there's a great American philosopher I like to quote, Yogi Berra, the baseball player. It's a terrible sport, but he's a good philosopher. And he said, the future ain't what it used to be. And because the future ain't what it used to be, businesses cannot assume they're going to be just as much in demand and just as needed as they were in the past. And as that's the case, that will restructure industries. So there is going to be consolidation. There is going to be expansion too. But it does mean that there's going to be a shift in the companies that we have seen before coming out of this could be bought, acquired, merged. I think you will see a lot of that take place over time. Governments will regulate it though, of course, and they'll regulate it with a renewed view of what their national or supranational interests are if that happens at the level of the EU versus an individual country. But nevertheless, there will be action that changes the shape of industries, and many industries are not going back to what they were before this crisis.
Yeah, you can definitely feel that the kind of CFIUS type of regulation over cross-border M&A is going to be higher than it has been before. No doubt about that. Yes. So as well as the Yogi Berra quote, the other one I like is making predictions is really tough, especially about the future. But I'm going to ask you to make one because a few of our questions have been asking about how you see the economic outcome, and your colleagues in their paper drew some 9 different potential of outcomes. The V's, the U's, the W's, the dreaded L. I mean, I know it's an impossible question, but I guess what's your instinct about how the economy behaves over the next year or so, and what more importantly, what are the things that are going to make that go one way or another?
Well, the reason we ended up with 9 scenarios is because it is dangerous to make predictions, especially about the future. And therefore, that was why we ended up with 9, because we recognize that this is a place where there's so many assumptions that have to be made. It's very difficult to forecast, but here goes anyway. And as we said, there were 9. Again, it was because of 2 real dimensions. One, regarding how effective the actions taken against the virus would be in controlling its spread and the duration of its spread. And the second around the effectiveness of the supply side or the government actions and interventions and how effective they were in biding time to suppress the virus. And I think if we look at where we are, we're somewhere in between the scenarios that say there's going to be somewhat effective control of the virus's spread, and we are going to be partially effective in terms of interventions. And I think that's the sort of area we're looking in at, because you can see, as I've said earlier, a plateauing in terms of the rate of increase in cases, in some cases coming down, recognizing that there are parts of the world like Africa where we haven't yet seen the full brunt of what could happen. And at the same time, we have found that the stimulus, and it's not really a stimulus, the bridging funding, if you want to call it that, has been sufficient to at least buy some time. But, I think where that leads you is it leads you to a U. And it leads you to a fat U, not a thin U. In other words, quite some gap.
Whoops.
You end up, no, we're back. Somebody called me. That's why it puts the thing on hold. When you see that happening, you start to get more in the camp of it's probably a U. We're probably going to take longer than we'd like. I think you might even be in a W where you get 2 U's joined together that are a little fatter than we'd like, because I think the real issue we have here is, will there be resurgence? And so I think if I was asked to pick some scenarios, I'd be in this camp in the middle where we probably have reasonable control. The stimuluses, bridging funding would bide the time, and it will allow us to get back to some kind of, not normalcy, some kind of next normal. But then we're going to be faced with what happens as waves kick in of reinfection until we have the vaccine. And that means you're very much now trying to forecast science. You're trying to forecast the moment at which either we have this mythical herd immunity, I say mythical because I don't pretend to fully grasp how long that's going to be before it really is a factor, other than to say it seems to be a very controversial topic. So I'm not going to venture a guess on that. Or something I feel more optimistic about, which is the development of a vaccine. But even there, time horizons seem to vary between 6 months to 15 months, 18 months, somewhere in that zone. And so you have to see those scenarios as being the ones that are most likely. And if you believe that, then we're going to have very severe hits to GDP this year, but continuing into 2021. And we're not going to see anything that gets back to where we were until the third quarter of 21 or even 22. So we've got quite some time to go in terms of the full economic consequences of what we're seeing today, even under, I think, a reasonably positive view of how this could play out. Much worse if the vaccines don't come.
So we had a question here about industry sectors, and someone's asking if you have a view of which industry sector is going to have to reimagine itself more than any other, and other questions about working from home. And so I put the two together, and I'll ask you about commercial real estate and the kind of office environment. But what do you? We're seeing the massive impact on travel and tourism and hospitality. Is that a temporary thing, or is that a kind of existential issue? So what's your sense of sectors that are going to have to really rethink themselves?
Well, the ones that, we actually had a report we released this morning, which is a European version of a report we released last week, looking at the impacts on employment in the US and in Europe. And in the US, we said up to 1/3 of workers would be impacted by furlough, layoffs, or other forms of action if the virus continues as it looks likely to continue in those scenarios I just talked about, the scenarios that are actually the more positive. We could paint some that are much worse. That was 1/3 for the US and about 25-26% for Europe. It reflects a difference in mix. The US is more skewed towards services sectors like retail, travel and leisure and so on than Europe. But both those numbers are enormous. In one case, it's 57 million. In the other case, it's just the numbers are too big to even contemplate. But they're huge numbers. And so if you were to read that report, you'd see that we say the most affected sector is indeed accommodation and food services, hospitality, leisure, travel. Second is the retail businesses outside of grocery retail, food retail, outside of food retail, non-food retailing businesses. Third is actually healthcare itself, because many forms of healthcare are being shut down or slowed down because of the need to focus everything on COVID-19. Fourth is construction, and fifth is administration support, that kind of thing. So you can tick through the sectors that are hardest hit now. The question is, will they bounce back? And we don't have a crystal ball. We do have China, and China's in some ways very different from the other markets and geographies that we would want to answer the question around. But let's take China for a moment. And in China, you see a mixed picture, because on the one hand, you see some genuinely puzzling, or you could say encouraging things like cruise bookings are way up. That may just be people who, I don't know what they have, but anyway, cruise bookings are up. You can make of that what you will. You can actually see travel coming back, domestic travel, much faster than anyone would expect international travel. And it's non-business domestic travel that's coming back. Restaurants are occupied again, but they have half the capacity they had before because of social or physical distancing. So you can get some sense that things will come back, but slowly, but they will come back. And so I think, again, you're in this landscape of trying to say for how long. And when you come to things like accommodation, leisure, hospitality, I think in the long term, people will get back to those if there's a vaccine, if there's a cure. But there's still going to be some legacy effects. I suspect distance, as I said before, will be seen differently. People are probably not going to want to be in very crowded spaces, and that's going to have an impact. So the cost may go up in return for taking some of the seats out. Cinema, are people going to go back to the cinema, or are we just going to see more movies released at first straight to direct-to-home distribution, as we saw with Trolls, the Disney movie that recently came out? So we're going to see, I think, lasting changes in those sectors. The remote from home and remote working will continue. I don't think people are going to continue solely to work from home, because there is something about people wanting to have social interaction and get together. But it is clearly the case that we're going to see people make new use and make greater use of the technologies that are now available. And as a result, they're going to treat remote working as something that has a different degree of importance and ability to execute, because the technology is so much greater now, so much better.
So we had a question from a fellow Scotsman saying that you are the supporter of a quote, the greatest football team in the world, unquote.
Why is that in quotes? That is accurate. We were dealing in facts here. Glasgow Celtic do merit that title. Now we can move on with the question, please.
So, yeah, I mean, his question is, how do you finish the season? And I suppose, you know, maybe you've got some views also. I mean, yeah, I'm a Watford fan, so I've got an interest in this, how the season finishes as well. So, but maybe more broadly about live entertainment as well, you know, as an industry. Are you going back to football matches in the future, do you think?
Well, how we finish the season is a subject of enormous controversy in Scotland, so I'm not going to wade into that other than to say 9 in a row is the right outcome. So that's all I'm going to say on that matter. With regard to the will live events, conferences, sports gatherings go back to where we were? I don't think they will go back exactly to where we were. And I think in the interim, because remote events have gained so much momentum, it'll be hard to displace them completely. But again, I do think people have the need to gather. There is something about camaraderie, but it's really going to hinge on a vaccine and confidence that we're actually, as a world, geared up to now deal with future pandemics, and that we have now learned some lessons. You know, people have been making the case that we should have seen some of this coming. There were people that forecasted that this may occur, that it's not a completely black swan event. If that's true now, we can debate, but it's certainly true that we've experienced it, and therefore, as we look ahead, I do think for people to feel confident and comfortable going back to crowds that sway and chant and stand so close together, there's going to have to be a real sense that we have now prepared to put in place and have safeguards to help with public health outbreaks, that we can move quickly. And I think absent that, we're probably not going to go back to where we were. Those events are going to feel very differently. I remember as we moved from terracing, where everybody stood, to seated stadiums, that felt like a huge, some of us felt, regressive step. Well, what if you have to take out every other step, every other seat, and the row in front and the row behind? That's maybe where we're going to end up. That would be very difficult. So I'm hopeful that we will get to a place where we do have a vaccine that addresses the virus, and we do have global public health steps and institutions that are empowered to take the actions needed to protect all of us. And in that context, we will be able to go back to where we were. But it's tough to see us that happening in the near future. It's going to take a bit of time.
Yeah, I tend to be an optimist, and also I think the nature of humanity is social, and I think it's hard. That's kind of hardwired into us that we want to be most of us want to be in places where other people are and enjoy events collectively.
I agree with that. I think that force will be felt full on, and that's why I'm optimistic that with a vaccine, with other steps, we will be able to go and celebrate with our teams and enjoy Celtic's continued dominance of Scottish football. But, you know, that it may just take us a little while to get there. But I'm really hopeful that is where we end up, because it is so important to the human psyche to have that feeling of belonging, to be part of something bigger. And that's why it does matter. And I think why I hope that we'll be in a position to feel confident about doing all those things, because it is so fundamental to human life. We don't just want to turn off all the lights and not turn them back on again.
Well, on that note, which is an optimistic note,
hello. And animals are very important too, let's not forget.
Oh my, I'm so sorry, but the dog has woken up. So on that
note, calling time. That's impressive.
I'm going to say thank you very much to Kevin, and
thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Wish everyone a stay well. Take care.